Welcome to the second episode of Hypothesize That, the UCB podcast where we peel back the layers of the scientific onion, revealing the core of curiosity. I'm your host, Nicola Hill, and in this edition, we're going to be considering a realm that's the frontier of medical breakthroughs and ethical debates, or is it? The world of clinical trials. In this episode, we're dissecting a hypothesis that's as bold as it's controversial. Imagine, if you will, a world where traditional clinical trials, those pillars of pharmaceutical advancement, become relics of the past. Gone are the days of extensive on-site visits as we enter a world where fully virtualized, decentralized clinical trials operate invisibly in the backgrounds of our daily lives. Well, joining me today to discuss this, I have two guests. I have with me Lewis Millen, who is the Global Clinical Science and Operations Innovation Lead at UCB. And joining us virtually from the US, I have Craig Lipset, who is the co-chair of the Decentralised Trials and Research Alliance. Welcome, Craig. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Nicola. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I think it's probably best that we start with the basics and let's really ask what clinical trials are. And actually, I think, Craig, probably you're the best person to answer this initial question.
Well, it's a great foundation for us to get started. Clinical trials are really the basis for us for evidence generation as we look to explore new treatment options. In the case for many of us that work with innovative new medicines in the biopharmaceutical industry, that's about evidence generation around the evidence of efficacy and safety for investigational new medicines. And we run these clinical trials with human participants, often around the world. Some of these individuals are exposed to the traditional standard of care, and others are exposed to this new investigational medicine. But that process of enrolling sometimes thousands of individuals with a given specific disease state and capturing robust, reliable, high-quality data and managing the oversight, protection, and safety of all of the parties involved is a very complex enterprise.
Quite burdensome, I imagine, Lewis.
Yeah, very much so. As Craig said, they've been around for a while. There's high standards required for the data that we collect, and our protocols reflect that. There's a lot of information and data required to satisfy the regulatory authorities, and from a scientific perspective, first and foremost. And that places burdens on not only the participants, the patients, but also the clinical research sites in making sure that they collect the data and it's of a high quality.
And these sites have to be worldwide, don't they? I mean, that must be a problem, Craig.
The sites are worldwide, in part because sometimes it's hard to find enough individuals in any one country, and also in part because we want to support the global registration of these new medicines. And so we want to ensure that there's trust and confidence that local patients have participated. And when we do that, we have that additional complexity of different regulatory frameworks and different expectations, especially when we start to talk about some of these innovative new approaches, some of these more cutting edge approaches where different regulatory authorities may be at different places in terms of their level of confidence and familiarity with the new.
So, gentlemen, I suppose our hypothesis we're discussing today is whether, those are no longer going to exist. Do you feel they're becoming obsolete, and do you feel that's the way forward?
I don't think so. I think that's my position on it. I think the need for collecting data from patients in a traditional way is going to be important from a scientific perspective. I think the investigators, the physicians that have the care of the patient and also are overseeing the clinical trial, they need to see the patient, they need to see the information, and also I think patients actually want to have that relationship with the physicians and the nurses at the sites. So there's a balance to be struck, but the hypothesis is very provocative, and I think there are elements of it that I think we should be shooting for, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, you're challenging it already, but let's just step back a bit before
Sure.
we actually challenge it. I use the word obsolete because I believe there are clues to this. Do you agree with that, Craig? It's becoming obsolete initially.
First off, I love the fact that you're using this term obsolete and raising this specter of obsolescence. As humans, it's our nature to fight obsolescence. But as drug developers, as scientists, as process engineers, we actually should aspire to obsolescence. If there are parts of how we do our work in the process of generating evidence of the safety and efficacy of new medicines, where there are better ways to do it that could render parts of our organizations, could render entire stakeholders in the process as obsolete, that's really painful and that's really hard. But if we're true to our North Star of doing right by patients, maybe it is the right thing to do. And I would argue that there are futures where every stakeholder in this enterprise could be made obsolete. CROs, research sites, biopharma sponsors. I would argue that the only stakeholder that isn't going to fight obsolescence are the patients themselves, many of whom don't want to be in a clinical trial and wouldn't want to be necessarily in the control arm of a trial as compared to having the hope and the promise of accessing an investigational new medicine. But I do agree with the point that Lewis was making that when we think about decentralization, there are probably some middle grounds where that are much more likely futures.
You mentioned beforehand digital technologies, and this is probably one of the ways in which decentralized clinical trials are progressing, perhaps without people really understanding. I mean, I'm wearing a Fitbit today. This is something that I have mainly because I want to count my steps and feel good at the end of the day that I've hit my 10,000 steps. But there's many other digital technologies that are already underway. I mean, do you want to share some of the other ones with us?
So I think the wearables piece is a big one. And I think particularly commercial devices like your Fitbit, like the Apple Watch that people wear in their everyday lives are becoming vehicles for collecting health data. And some of those are just informational and important for fitness and well-being. They might also be helpful for healthcare and potentially for clinical research as well as we get more clinical grade wearables. There's also clinical trial platforms where we collect data from participants and from the clinical research sites. I think we're seeing the start of more integration there into the sort of the normal healthcare paradigm. We're still, I think, as a clinical research community, a little bit clunky with that. I think we hear clinical trial sites complaining about having multiple sign-ons, different ways of having to enter the data, and I think it's really frustrating. And for participants, integrating commercial grade technology to collect their data when they have to enter it is going to be increasingly important. People do it every day for their banking and various other things. We're not necessarily in that sort of seamless user interface with clinical trial collection means. So I think we are seeing improvements there, but I think integration and ease of use, I think we need to see more of to make it more accessible and easier.
Do you think, Craig, that people are actually aware that they're taking part in some of these decentralized clinical trials? I was thinking, for example, I know that you get them in the US, Apple EarPods that can actually measure your hearing. And of course, the Apple Watch can measure your ECG. Do you think the public is aware of what a decentralized clinical trial is?
I don't think the public is aware of a concept of a decentralized trial, and I don't know if they need to be. I think that our job is to make clinical trials accessible, and our North Star should be to make research participation accessible for all. Decentralized trials and decentralized methods are a means to an end for us to achieve that goal. To an individual, most humans will probably never be in a clinical trial. And if they are, they'll probably only be in one. And so it's today not an experience that people are re-encountering over and over again that they can really benchmark. I was once in a conventional trial and now I'm in a decentralized trial. For most people, that experience will just be research participation. And hopefully we can reduce the friction, reduce the barriers by leveraging these methods, including the digital endpoints, including that use of those wearables and connected devices that you mentioned earlier. Because one thing that's truly ready for obsolescence in many cases are the endpoints that we've been relying on for our studies. The endpoints are the thing that we measure in our trial, whether for understanding efficacy and understanding safety. And we spend hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a new treatment, all to run a clinical trial to measure that endpoint. And all too often, we use phrases like this endpoint is the gold standard, when in truth, it's barely cast in tin. Many of our endpoints are just sorely outdated. One of the last studies I worked on in industry a few years back was in alopecia areata, where the prevailing endpoint is something called the SALT score, where dermatologists look at somebody's scalp and pretend it's broken up into quadrants and then try to guesstimate on a scale of 0 to 100 how much hair regrowth there is. That's kind of absurd. That's the endpoint, at the outcome of investing hundreds of millions of dollars. The success or failure of that medicine and its accessibility for humans is going to be based on how well somebody can guesstimate how much hair has regrown. Or in other cases, we have patients that are traveling a huge distance to get to a research site just to walk for 6 minutes back and forth in the hallway between cones placed 100 feet apart. We call it the 6-minute walk test, and we use this in movement disorders and heart failure. And again, people are walking, a huge distance across the city, subways, trains, buses to get to the site just to walk some more. And we know there are better ways to measure these, sometimes as easy as using the device that's already in their pockets.
I just think that integration with of clinical research and everyday tech, I think that's going to be a huge part of the future here, and rightly so. And I think Craig makes some great points about, the North Star of obsolescence for clinical research. I think we all believe that, but actually just making use of what tech is emerging in everyday life is going to be a huge part of the future.
Can I ask you, what percentage of clinical trials at UCB then are decentralised?
So we've been doing decentralised clinical trials for a few years. Over the last 6 years, more than 50% of our studies have remote options. So we're doing pretty well, and across the industry, from data that are available from last year, the industry was sort of tracking at about a quarter, and it's increasing. So we'll definitely see that rise. But you can see there's still a way to go to that 100% of studies having options for remote accessibility, whether it's the data or whole visits.
Is it easier to get patients to join the trials when they're decentralised?
I don't think so. I think Craig makes a great point about generally people don't see the difference between clinical trials and decentralised clinical trials. I think that's very much people that work in clinical research that have that distinction. So I don't think necessarily people would know that, but what they would know is how easy or otherwise it is to participate in the study. So how flexible is it? Do they have to go to the research site for every single visit? Can they do some of it at home? Can they do some of the assessments at home? And can they choose? Craig, I think I've been in a conversation with you before where we've spoken about that flexibility and optionality. I think that's becoming increasingly important.
Often for clinical trials, we talk about this idea of a recruitment funnel. We have to help engage individuals. We have to help find people to make them aware of a study, and they sit at the top of a funnel, and then they move through that funnel with eligibility criteria and making that decision if the study is right for them. And I think that's where decentralized methods start to come in, because when people that have found a trial or that a trial has found them are making that decision of, could I actually participate? We know that burden is a significant factor that weighs on their ability to do so, whether it's the burden of missing work or the burden of managing family or just the burden of being a patient managing a chronic disease. And so this is where these decentralized methods can hopefully help to make it easier for patients who are considering research to be able to say yes. I think as Lewis notes, from there, very often our hope, our aspiration is to create choice and flexibility for people. And I think increasingly that's what all of us are expecting in our lives. I'm able to join you through video today because we have choice and flexibility in how we engage. I could see a doctor over video or go into the office. Those choices make sense.
You are relying upon people, though, to, if I'm right, to input information for themselves. I know during COVID, for example, I inadvertently became part of a trial for an antibiotic because they said if you were diagnosed within 3 days, sign up, we'll send you something. And I thought, oh, as a health journalist, why not try this? But it was reliant upon me to put something into every single day, an online diary of how I was feeling. So you will have people who don't like this because they're not tech savvy or they're not computer literate or they simply just don't really like sharing that personal data.
I think that ideally we can start to see pathways where using these types of tools, our studies can become more invisible, more seamless, more integrated in everybody's day-to-day life. If I am using different types of connected devices or sensors, can these become more invisible to you and require me to ask less of you in terms of manual reporting of how you're feeling? And when I have today a diary that may be very laborious with 20, 40, 60 questions to ask you each day, could I start to envision ways that maybe a chatbot or just a voice device in your home is just asking you, how are you feeling today? And you're able to have a natural human conversation that can elicit and abstract the same amount or maybe even better data. Because sometimes those types of technologies are able to not only listen to the words, but to listen to the spaces between the words, the changes in my voice and inflection that may suggest other insights, other metadata about my response. And so I think there are very exciting paths forward where we can start to reduce that burden of manual data collection, of burdensome surveys and questionnaires, and start to see how digital tools, including generative AI and chatbots, could actually make participation that much easier.
Is that something you've had experience with at UCB?
Yeah, I think Craig speaks really well about some of those elements, and I completely agree with him. I mean, something else we've been looking at is the concept of tokenization. So a process which protects people's sensitive information, replacing with non-sensitive elements called tokens. And then in healthcare, that tokenization can link the clinical trial data with real-world data whilst keeping that patient information private. That's quite a new technology in clinical research, but we believe that it's quite important for that sort of blending of clinical research and general healthcare. So it'll be interesting to see where that takes us.
But of course, people still like to see doctors.
Yeah.
Now, I thought it was very interesting when you were talking about the technology can listen to the spaces. I thought that was a fascinating phrase, Craig, but it's still not the same as seeing a physical healthcare professional, is it?
It's not, but in many cases, the real superpower that I think we can start to see in healthcare today is the combination of humans that are supported by technologies. And so, not necessarily expecting me to just rely on my doctor going forward, but also not expecting me to just rely on logging into a large language model at home and starting to ask AI chatbots for their insights. I think that going forward, we as patients will expect our doctors to become AI enhanced. We'll expect our doctors to have access to and to make use of these types of tools in our interactions because it will make them that much more potent and impactful. There are natural things that we as humans and that clinicians might listen to in the inflection in my voice, for example. But I think that there are additional clues and insights that technology and only technology could really start to elicit and deduce, especially when we think about change over time. Is how I'm answering this question today very different in 6 months, in 9 months, as we're looking to follow an individual over time?
It's interesting that Craig mentions about the voice thing. At UCB, we've encountered some startups in the innovation space in recent years, and one of them was around looking at biomarkers using voice recognition, elements of voice, like Craig said, pitch, tone, etc., as markers for the disease progression. So not to replace the clinician, but to support, and another way of collecting data about the disease and progression or improvement.
I think an important challenge for us as we think about challenging the hypothesis and we're making use of tokenization or making use of different types of listening types of technologies is ensuring transparency around our tools, transparency around the approaches that we're using so that we don't lose trust with the patients that are involved in our studies. One great use case for tokenization, as an example, is the ability to create synthetic data about me, to create a digital twin of me, to be able to access different real-world data that I've generated throughout my journey as a patient, and to be able to create a digital version of me. Maybe that digital version of me could be enrolled in your study, in the control arm for a trial. Who is providing consent for that digital twin in terms of how my data is used in those different use cases? How do you ensure that I have the right levels of engagement and transparency? Likewise, the importance of trust when we're using video or voice measurements to make sure that this doesn't turn into a surveillance creepy state, but is something that's truly meaningful for science and meaningful for me as an individual.
I think people are worried about identity theft and personal data leaks. Trust is a good word there. How can you convince people that it's okay and that their personal data will be protected? What are you doing at UCB with that one?
You think about things like GDPR. I mean, we're putting the highest levels of security and scrutiny on that and all the systems we use. So we have our own internal processes, and that information will go to ethics committees and regulators, so it's scrutinised externally as well. But I think it's a really good point. People are understandably concerned about data privacy, and I mentioned tokenisation as an example. It's going to be really important that we have the highest levels of data security and privacy.
I think during COVID, people became much more accepting of the fact that you can have virtual appointments with healthcare professionals, and they have embraced technology a lot more than they did before 2020. So I'm presuming that building upon that can be of benefit and can convince people that you might not see a physical doctor, you might have that AI enhancement, but you're still going to get the right treatment. Would you say, Craig?
I think that coming out of the pandemic, there's certainly a heightened level of comfort and familiarity with using different virtual technologies, remote monitoring tools, and certainly our use of video, whether it's in business and education, and of course, as we're talking about here, in healthcare. I think one thing that the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical research enterprise in general, has done very well is manage data integrity, data quality, data protection. Because when we think about the true guardrails for clinical trials today, it's always been for us patient safety and data integrity. But I think that we tend to keep that hidden behind the curtain. I think we explain to patients in informed consents and in other places that your data is safe, and it is. And we have tremendous machinery running behind the curtain that's monitoring patients for safety and protecting their data. I think we have to figure out how to do a better job of lifting that curtain and helping to expose and help people to see the levels of protection and confidence that we can bring around how their data is being handled, but do it in ways that people can understand. And I think that's kind of new for many of us.
Just to continue challenging the hypothesis, finally, what about remembering the person, though? I mean, one of the instances where somebody on a clinical trial, they're being monitored, they're having regular appointments with a healthcare professional, a doctor, a nurse, whatever, who might spot something else that's wrong with them.
Yeah.
It might be a psychological issue or a different symptom. Now, I know you said you can put in this tech to listen to the spaces to try and analyse if someone's voice is changing. Do you think that can actually equal a human being?
I don't think it necessarily has to equal a human being, although I do think that it can. For our clinical trials, there will still be a role of an investigator, whether that is an investigator that a person is seeing in an in-person interaction or through a virtual interaction. Decentralized methods and trials done right should make a patient feel closer to their investigators. Decentralized trials done wrong should make a person feel alone and isolated with an investigational medicine and some unfamiliar technology. I think if we do this right, it means that people have more connectivity, more ability to see those investigators and study staff just doing it using more virtual technologies. And by having greater access, what I mean is versus the traditional model that for me to see that investigator staff, I'd have to travel a great distance, and I'm really only invited to do so once every 6 weeks or 3 months, according to the protocol schedule.
Well, I think we've discussed quite a lot of the challenges of this hypothesis, but, do you think that we've proved that it does have a reality to it? Do you think, and there is a timescale here, within the next decade, traditional clinical trials will become obsolete? I'm presuming you say that is a possibility, Craig.
I do think that there will be future studies in the industry that will benefit from fully virtual, fully remote approaches. But in truth, what our North Star needs to be is to continue to stop and listen to patients and to understand their preferences and how to engage and how to participate. And today, when we do that, the signal is pretty clear. Patients want choice. There are times in their journey as a patient that they will simply feel better going into a clinic and having an in-person interaction with the investigator and with study staff, and we should never want to deny that. And so for that reason, I would expect that in the foreseeable future, most of our models with industry will be hybrid, will be ones where we're creating choice and flexibility for individuals rather than completely doing away with the existing model of site-based research.
So no obsolescence. Do you agree with that then, Lewis?
Yeah, I'm sticking to my guns, Nicola. I think maybe one day, but certainly within the next decade, I completely agree with what Craig said. I think we'll see an evolution, maybe not a revolution. And I think the idea of choice and optionality for patients is going to be key. At UCB, we have an approach called human-centric health, where we put patients at the heart of clinical research as partners. We're looking to maximise diversity and access to clinical trials, and also engaging with patients throughout their health journey. And I think using innovation to do that is going to be key. So let's keep pushing on with it.
So obsolescence is not achievable then. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining me today. That was really interesting. I want to say a big thank you then to my two guests, to Craig Lipset, co-chair of the Decentralised Trials and Research Alliance, joining us via video from the US, and to Lewis Millen, who is Global Clinical Sciences and Operations Innovation Lead at UCB. I think that was fabulous contributions, a really interesting discussion. Lots of technical hurdles still lie ahead, I think, as far as clinical trials, decentralised or not. But it certainly was a testament to the power of questioning and possibilities that are ahead in the realms of science. What do you think? If you'd like to join in the conversation, please do on our social media pages and use the hashtag Hypothesize That.